Yes.
Professor Ludlam, do you agree it is important for patients to be aware of the risks of their treatment?
I think it's important that patients appreciate the benefits and the potential side effects of treatment, yes.
And do you accept that from 1980 it was your responsibility as the consultant in charge and the director of the Haemophilia Centre to provide or ensure that your colleagues provided adequate information to patients about the risks and benefits of treatment?
I think that's reasonable, yes.
Now, on such occasions, also on occasions when you discussed the risks and benefits of treatment with patients, did you record such discussions or the provision of information to patients in their records or anywhere else?
I was not a good note taker, a writer in medical records at that time. One of the things that I was taught in Cardiff, not by Professor Bloom, but by one of his senior colleagues, was there's no need to write the obvious that you would have done anyway in the case notes. Only write positive observations. For example, when you're examining a patient, you need only record that they've got an enlarged spleen. You don't have to record they don't have an enlarged spleen, so that someone reading it subsequently can ensure that you've actually assessed the spleen. The assumption being that you would have, of course, have assessed the spleen in this particular situation. So I have to say I was not a very good recorder in my case notes of what happened.
Does that mean then if you did have a conversation with the patient about the risks and benefits of treatment, let's say it was a patient you were seeing for the first time and they were about to receive factor concentrates, whether commercial or NHS, does that mean you wouldn't have recorded that discussion routinely in the records in the early 80s?
If it was a first-time treatment, the chances are I might have recorded. I would have talked to the patient about the risks. I'm not sure whether I've recorded it or not. I agree it's not good practice and wouldn't be good practice now, but I'm not sure that I would have done.
And does that mean it's less likely still that you would have recorded those discussions in the case of a patient who was not a first-time patient?
I think it likely I wouldn't have done, because it would be part of the routine conversation. Your liver tests last time you were here were as follows. This is a bit better and worse than it was the time before.
When you took over from Dr. Davis, did you ascertain what information had routinely been provided to Edinburgh patients about the risks of hepatitis?
No, I don't know, except that it seemed to be, when I arrived, it seemed to be sort of general knowledge that amongst the patients that hepatitis was a subject around. The only little bit of evidence I can think of at the moment is Dr. Davis, when he set up the home treatment arrangements, and as you know, there are only a small number of patients, he asked them to sign a form to say that they agreed to treat themselves and that there was the possibility of hepatitis as a result of their therapy. It was certainly also discussed, for example, at the Haemophilia Society Scottish meetings. They had meetings of the patient group from time to time, and certainly I know that at least on one occasion, this was referred to. So I think there was a general awareness. I brought it very explicitly, I think, to all patients' attention, probably in 1980, possibly 81, but I think probably 80, when I gave each patient a little printed slip of paper to put in their haemophilia card. Their haemophilia card was a card that they carried with them that said that they had haemophilia, what kind of haemophilia it was, where they were registered, and who to contact in case of emergency. And this was sort of passport for getting treatment readily at another haemophilia centre. If they were travelling, they got a bleed, they could, if they weren't on, didn't have treatment with them, they could go to the local haemophilia centre. And I gave each patient a little slip of paper printed on it saying, please give this patient, if possible, NHS factor 8 if they come for treatment, or cryoprecipitate, I think particularly NHS, and not to use commercial, and that I would be prepared to reimburse them with factor 8 concentrate from our stock if need be. So I would have explained to patients about hepatitis, each of them individually. They would have known at least that way. But it was generally known amongst patients that hepatitis was a feature of haemophilia treatment. And I think most people distinguish between hepatitis B and non-A, non-B, although I would refer to it as hepatitis rather than non-A, non-B hepatitis.
I just want to as it were, unpick the various sources of information you've referred to there, Professor Ludlam. You referred to Haemophilia Society patient meetings. Are those meetings that you attended?
I was invited to some of them to speak. I don't think I was generally invited to their meetings because they were for the patients rather than the treaters. We did have a local haemophilia group for Edinburgh, which was quite difficult to keep going, particularly when home treatment came available and there was less campaigning to get more home treatment. And it ended up, I seem to recall, with one parent, myself and the haemophilia sister, gathering one evening, and no patients turned up. So it was very difficult to keep a local group going. The Scottish group was quite a strong group and used to meet on a Saturday afternoon, I think it was, every few months, and husbands and wives would go along, and I think there'd be a talk and afternoon tea, a sort of social gathering.
Were you present at any Haemophilia Society meetings in the first half of the 1980s at which the risks of hepatitis, and in particular non-A, non-B hepatitis, were explicitly discussed?
I wasn't personally at any, I can't recall meetings that I was personally at.
You've referred to the consent form used by Dr. Davis. I think that's the form that's at WITN 3428006, please, Shomek.
I think I also used the same form when I started patients on home therapy.
So is this the form that you're referring to? It's an exhibit to your witness statement.
Yes, yes. Yes, and I asked patients to sign. My predecessor designed it. We had a heap of them, so I asked patients to sign them.
It seems quite formal to have its signature witnessed by, and then space for a witness and occupation of witness. Do you know why Dr. Davis introduced that, and is that a practice you adhered to?
I saw that for the first time just now. I certainly wouldn't have asked for a witness or the occupation of a witness. Dr. Davis had a degree of formality and correctness about things. And I think also it's a reflection of home therapy being something rather unusual. We take it for granted these days, for example, that nurses take blood and give medicines by intravenous injection as a matter of course. But in the 1980s, the early 1980s, it was unheard of, and I had to address the rather formidable nursing hierarchy to enable our newly appointed nurse, Hemophilia sister, to be able to take blood from patients. So it was a very different era, and as I say, I hadn't noticed that a witness and their occupation were asked for.
Where would this form, once signed by an individual, by patient, forget the question of witnesses, where would it then go? Would it be kept with the patient's medical records or in other records, and if so, where?
No, there was a separate file that these went in.
So it wouldn't be part of the patient's medical records?
That's my memory, yes.
And then if we look at the text of it, you're right to point out that it refers to hepatitis. It says, I understand that there's a risk of reactions to such materials. I also understand that such materials may carry the virus of hepatitis and may constitute a risk to myself and to others. Right. It doesn't actually descend to specifics about hepatitis B or non-A, non-B hepatitis, does it?
No.
And it doesn't say anything about the seriousness of hepatitis or the possibility, at least, of developing a chronic condition or the possibility of liver disease.
No, I agree.
In terms then of the piece of paper that you provided to your patients to go in their haemophilia card or passport, as I think you described it, that piece of paper, I don't think we have a sample, but some witnesses, individuals have also made reference to it, stated what treatment they were on, but that piece of paper, as I understand from your description, didn't itself talk about hepatitis at all.
That's correct. No, I don't think it referred to hepatitis. It referred to the desirability of the patient receiving an NHS treatment.
If we look at your witness statement, Seamus, it's WITN 3428001. And if we go to page 83, please. In answer to the question, did you take steps to ensure patients were informed and educated about the risks of hepatitis and HIV? And we'll leave aside HIV till tomorrow, Professor. You've provided a number of answers here. A says this, so paragraph 212A, reminding patients about the risk of viral infection from using blood products was part of the routine arrangement for patients and was evident with the standard blood tests at review clinics and feedback of the results of these at subsequent clinics. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes. When a patient was reviewed, I would have looked at the results of the liver function tests and commented on them. I'd have looked at the results of the hepatitis B tests. I'd have looked at their full blood count, make sure that they weren't anemic or had a raised white count. Those would be the main, and I would tell the patient what the results were, and discuss them as seemed appropriate.
So you would perhaps discuss if there were significant liver function test abnormalities.
Just a moment, you're nodding again.
I'm sorry, I was agreeing.
Yes, I thought you were, but you understand why I ask.
Yes, I do.
Did you actually tell patients that there was a risk from the factor concentrates that they were receiving or about to receive of developing not only hepatitis B, which that they may have known about through the vaccination program in the early 80s, but a risk of developing non-A, non-B hepatitis? Or did you just refer generally, as I think one of your earlier answers suggested, to hepatitis?
I referred to hepatitis with the meaning of not what we're now calling non-A, non-B hepatitis, and I would have referred to hepatitis B as hepatitis B.
And did you tell your patients, again we're talking about the first half of the 80s predominantly here, that there was a risk that the factor concentrates could give rise to chronic hepatitis and the possibility of progressive liver disease?
Well, I would certainly have told them that they had chronic hepatitis. I'm not sure to what extent I would have said there's a good chance or a significant chance this will be serious. Because we didn't, at least I didn't really know in the early 80s what the long-term outlook was likely to be.
I understand that you may not have told them there was a good chance of developing something, but did you, as far as you can recall, tell your patients that there was a risk of if they either started or continued with treatment with factor concentrates, a risk that could result in liver damage?
Oh, that was clear, yes. That it could result in liver damage, and one advised because of that to patients to moderate the amount of alcohol they drank.
Did you tell them that it could result in serious liver damage?
I'm sorry, I can't recall exactly how far and how severe. It was sufficiently important, the liver changes, damage that I was perceiving, that I was advising patients to moderate the amount of alcohol they drank, because that would exacerbate or possibly exacerbate damage to their liver.
Would the kind of conversations that you're describing take place only where you had a patient who had, for example, abnormal liver tests? Or would they take place with every patient who would be being treated with factor concentrates, irrespective of their liver function tests?
It would tend to be with most patients, because most patients at one time or another on concentrate had abnormal liver function tests. So it was part of the standard discussion with the patients.
Could we look at one of the documents you prepared for the Penrose inquiry? It's PRSE 3062. And if we can go to the second page, please. We look at the bottom of the second page, last paragraph. You say this: it was our policy to inform patients and parents of children of all the risks of haemophilia as well as its treatment, including hepatitis, because virtually all recipients of blood products were likely to be at risk or suffer from this complication. So I'm just going to show you one other sentence on the next page and then ask you a question. If we can go to the next page. We look at paragraph C. If we pick it up 5 lines down, you say, although it was our policy to inform patients requiring blood product for the first time of the risk of hepatitis, and then you go on to talk about how it might be expected that information might not be recalled by patients. Now, can I ask you to clarify, was it your policy to inform patients of the risks of hepatitis when they were receiving blood products for the first time, or which is what this passage suggests, or was it your policy to inform patients of the risks whenever they received treatment with blood products?
Well, what's up on this page is certainly the case. I wouldn't say to a patient every time they got an infusion of cryoprecipitate or factor VIII concentrate, this may give you hepatitis or may exacerbate the hepatitis you've already got. Because that was accepted knowledge by the patient, just like they might develop an anti-factor VIII antibody, which is really a catastrophic thing that the patients don't want to have, but which is a complication of treatment. So you don't warn a patient every time you give them an infusion they might get hepatitis from it.
In relation to the patients you were seeing early 1980s, most of those, presumably, apart from young children or people who moved into the area, would be patients who were not new to the centre. They'd be patients who had been seen by and treated by Dr. Davis, possibly in some cases for a number of years.
Yes.
Did you assume that Dr. Davis had told them about the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis, and that it was not necessary for you to do so?
Well, I think it was, if I can put it this way, sort of common knowledge amongst patients. As you have shown earlier, Dr. Davis was a member of the Hepatitis Working Party, so an interest in liver disease and hepatitis. As I think you probably know, there were a number of studies done in the 1970s and early 1980s in relation to hepatitis B, which were initiated by Dr. Davis. So he was very well aware, and I think he would have shared that with the patients. There were no secrets, and he was a very forthcoming individual, very engaging, very educative. I learned a great deal. One of the reasons I became a hematologist was because of his enthusiasm for haemophilia and for haematology in general.
Does that mean the answer to my question, did you assume that he'd have told them, is yes, you did assume that he would have explored the risks or explained the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis with patients who were coming to you who'd previously been seen by Dr. Davis?
Yes.
And does that mean that you would not yourself have felt it necessary to explain the risks to them again, because you would proceed on the basis that that's something your patients already knew?
Well, it would be part of the conversation with the patient at a review clinic. And I would judge by how they responded to what I was telling them about their liver tests. If they looked very surprised that I was showing them some liver test results, then it would indicate to me that maybe they didn't know much about it. I'd tell them more. But mostly, patients indicated that, well, yes, they knew about this, and yes, thanks for the update.
Am I right in understanding that at this time there was no written information, other than what we've seen in that consent form? There was no written information provided to patients about non-A, non-B hepatitis or hepatitis more generally?
I think that's correct, yes. I can't recall any.
And if we just look at this passage again that's on the screen, you say, I'll read the same sentence again, but carry on with it. You say, although it is our policy to inform patients requiring blood product for the first time of the risk of hepatitis, if diagnosis of haemophilia was concurrent with an acute painful bleed, it is to be expected that information given might not later be recalled. And then in relation to parents, you're saying not only were usually parents having to try and quickly understand about the condition of haemophilia, but they usually had a very upset child to comfort. In these stressful circumstances, the chance of the information given being recalled would be reduced because of the stress. You refer to some Haemophilia Society booklets, which I think we're still trying to track down. If it's the case that because a patient is experiencing an acute bleed or because a parent is dealing with a very upset child, that you think they might not be taking in or recalling the information, would you agree it's all the more important to provide that information in writing or to repeat it at later sessions?
I don't know that it would be necessarily appropriate to provide it in writing. It is likely that it would be part of the discussion later on, certainly.
In your statement at page 308, it's paragraph 308, it's WITN 3428001. So WITN 3428001. We go to page 108, please. If we look at paragraph 308, you will see the question that you were asked was referred to witnesses to the inquiry who'd said that they were not given sufficient or any information about the risks of treatment. And you say in the last sentence of paragraph 308, it is possible that patients may not recollect exactly what they were told, particularly with the passage of many years. You'll be aware that there are witnesses, patients of yours, who've given evidence to the inquiry that they weren't informed of the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis. Is that your response, that they may not recollect what they've been told?
If I was involved in their treatment, I hope I would have explained the situation to them, the risks to them. If they were not treated by me, I would hope they would have been, but I can't vouch for other doctors.
You told us this morning when describing your work and the various responsibilities that you had, that quite a lot of the day-to-day clinical work would have been done by, for example, the registrars, under your supervision in the way in which you described to the chair. Were there any instructions or guidance for such registrars or others, the Haemophilia sister, for example, as to what information they should provide to patients about the risks of treatment?
I don't think there was any written information or protocols as one might have nowadays that I can recall. So I would have explained to the staff who came to work in the Haemophilia Centre what the risks were. They would have sat in with me to begin with, seeing patients, and I hope it would have become clear what my usual practice was and what was appropriate to say to patients.
Is it possible, even likely, that the reason some patients have said they were not told of the risks of treatment is not that they've forgotten, but that those risks were not clearly communicated to them at the time?
It is possible. I think it's unlikely. I can think of one or two instances of patients presenting actually de novo with an intracranial bleed, for example. I think it's obviously not in a position to discuss the situation then. But I would hope that most patients, certainly ones that I was directly involved with, would understand the risks of therapy.
There's a further document I'm going to invite you to look at, Professor Ludlam. It's HCDO 40-270_031. We can see if we look at the top of the page, it's minutes of the 12th meeting of the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Hepatitis Working Party on the September the 14th, 1983, and you are recorded as present. If we go to the top of the next page, you'll see it says this: with regard to NHS Factor 8, the paper describing the prospective study of NHS and commercial Factor 8 would shortly be submitted for publication, and this showed that there was a 100% chance of contracting non-A, non-B hepatitis, whether the product was made from NHS Factor 8 or commercial sources. Do you know whether that's a reference to the Fletcher paper that I think you've referred to in your evidence at some stage?
I think it is, yes.
Now, I'm not asking you for your comments on whether what's said in that paper is right or not, but bearing in mind that at the Hepatitis Working Party in September 1983, it appears to be the view that there's a 100% chance of contracting non-A, non-B from NHS factor concentrates as well as commercial. Is that something that you told your patients who were receiving predominantly NHS concentrates? Did you tell them you have a 100% chance of contracting non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I think patients, all my patients who were regularly receiving NHS concentrate, which was, as you see, virtually all the patients, understood that the hepatitis came from NHS concentrates. There was a view prior to this publication that maybe NHS factor VIII concentrates were safer from the point of view of hepatitis than commercial products. And some of the work that we did subsequently, I think, bore this out when hepatitis C was discovered, and we set up assays for it. But there was never the suggestion that NHS factor VIII was, if I put it this way, free of hepatitis, although it appeared to be, it had a reputation for being less likely to cause hepatitis than commercial concentrates.
You see, Professor Ludlam, your patients, some of your patients may have thought that because they were receiving Scottish concentrates, and some have said this in their evidence to the inquiry, because they're receiving Scottish concentrates, that's safer. Leave aside completely the question of HIV, because we're going to turn to that tomorrow. But now you have, in September of 1983, something published which is telling clinicians such as yourself that there's a 100% chance if you're treated with an NHS factor concentrate, you're going to get non-A, non-B hepatitis. Isn't that information which should be shared with patients at that point?
But the patients already knew they had hepatitis, because when they came to the clinic, we discussed the liver function test from the previous visit. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, if one would give the patient the results and say they compare them with how they'd been for the previous visits. So patients were universally aware, or virtually universally aware, that hepatitis was a feature of treatment with NHS products.
So is this your evidence that by the time we're talking out here, September 1983, all of your patients who were receiving treatment with concentrates knew as a matter of fact that they had non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I would hope that they knew. I should say they didn't all have evidence of hepatitis. There were a small number of patients who appeared to have normal liver function tests, or virtually normal liver function tests, persistently. And we now know that there's a group of patients who actually cleared their hepatitis C, as it came to be known. So not all patients had chronic hepatitis. There was about 10 or 15% who cleared the virus and were fortunate in not having persistent and potentially progressive liver disease.
You've told us that you may not have recorded in patients' records at the time discussions about the risks of treatment. Would you have recorded in patients' records at the time the fact that they had non-A, non-B hepatitis?
No, because it would be obvious from looking at the liver function tests. If they had a particularly acute episode, or they were symptomatic from it, yes, one would put that in. But if they came up for a review and their liver tests were slightly different from the previous occasion, it's unlikely I would have written anything. It would have been not I think worthy of comment.
Is it possible that the conversations you had with your patients during this time were more along the lines of, you've got some abnormal liver function tests, but it's nothing to worry about?
No, I think it was along the lines of you've got some what we used to call transaminitis, intermittently raised transaminases, and we don't really understand what the consequences of the seriousness of this is. But in the early 1980s, we weren't too concerned.
What, if any, steps did you take at the Edinburgh Centre in the first half of the 1980s to reduce the risk of your patients being exposed to non-A, non-B hepatitis?
We discussed right at the beginning about desmopressin and cryoprecipitate for patients who could be adequately treated with those preparations. It would be a matter of trying to avoid blood products as much as possible. My desire not to use, if possible, commercial concentrates was because of the hepatitis risk, because it was good evidence that it might be a separate virus, and that it would be as well to, if one could, to avoid patients getting that.
So I note the time, and I'm going to move on to a separate topic, so this might be the most sensible point to end the afternoon's evidence.
Yes, certainly. Just one matter, if I may, Professor. You mentioned to Council that you would tend to discuss with those, apart from yourself, who might administer treatment within your centre. You discuss with them what to say, in effect, and they'd shadow you and see how you did it. I gather from what you're saying about knowledge, your knowledge, and knowledge generally, of non-A, non-B hepatitis, that no one quite knew how serious it might be. There were a realization there was a risk it might be serious. There was a thought it might not be. Would it also follow that no one, that the picture might become clearer as further research was done?
Yes.
To what extent during the early 1980s did you tell those who were administering treatment apart from yourself of any of these changes that might affect the extent to which, or the emphasis they put upon what they said to patients?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand. You asking about research?
No, I'm not. I'm asking about information to patients.
I'm sorry.
And the question is based on this, that you're advising patients of what you see as the risk, or you might be. If you advise them as to the risk, you will advise them as your best knowledge of the risk at the time.
Yes.
If you tell others who are working under your supervision broadly what the risks are, that is the risks at the time you tell them. That may need to be updated if the situation generally as to the knowledge of risk is changing, mightn't it?
Yes, I would be discussing with my colleagues more of the background, probably, as to how there came to be a range of risks that this particular personal paper suggested that it was had these risks. So I'm getting a bit tired.
don't worry.
I'm sorry. I would I would explain to, for example, to my registrar that Pierre Minucci might have had this view, and his papers showed certain things, and that Preston's papers showed other things. I'd have been discussing at a more in-depth level, obviously, with the medical staff than I would with the patients.
Yes. And what did you do to check that the general import of that change in general view was being told to the patients by people other than yourself, but people for whose advice to the patients you were responsible?
I think it was ensuring that the staff who worked with me were, if I can put it this way, held the sort of views that I wanted promulgated. My views, my prejudices, if you like, what I thought about particular situations, that, to caricature it, if you like, was the party line. That's the best way I can describe it. And it was my responsibility to keep staff educated with the changes as time went by. There were new information became available that would be shared with staff. That was part of the educational process. We had weekly meetings, excuse me, in the department, and we would discuss recent papers and with outside speakers. And it was an evolving ambience in which changing views became part of the fabric.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a longish day for you, so I will take a break now. The same rules apply, of course, overnight as do at lunchtime or at any other break. But I hope, I wish you a safe journey back home, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. We start at 10, so we'll see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.